The trip was supposed to be an escape. A week off the grid, deep in the mountains, just me, my friend Eric, and the vast wilderness. No cell service, no distractions, just nature. We had been planning it for months, mapping out trails, packing gear, preparing for the isolation, but nothing could have prepared us for what we found out there. The first few days were perfect. Crisp air, golden autumn leaves, the distant sound of a river guiding us deeper into the woods. At night, the stars stretched endlessly above us, their glow untouched by city lights. It felt like freedom. Then on the fourth night, things started to change. We had set up camp near a clearing, not far from a narrow, overgrown trail that wasn't marked on our maps. It didn't seem well-traveled, but curiosity got the best of us. The next morning, we decided to follow it. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just silence. The air felt heavier, like something was pressing against my chest. After about an hour, we found something strange. A pile of bones. Not scattered, not remnants of a predator's meal, but stacked neatly in a mound. Some were small, likely from animals, but others looked too large, too human-like. Eric laughed it off, said it was probably some hunter's way of marking territory. I didn't buy it, but I didn't argue. We kept going. Then we saw the cabins. 3 of them, abandoned and rotting, hidden so deep in the forest that it was clear no one had used them in decades. The windows were shattered, the wooden doors barely hanging on their hinges. But there were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones. Someone had been here. A rusted sign, barely legible, hung from one of the cabins. The Hollow Trail, established 1954. I don't like this, I muttered. Eric shrugged. It's just old ruins. Let's check them out. I didn't want to, but I wasn't about to argue alone in the middle of nowhere. The inside of the first cabin was worse than I expected. The walls were lined with strange carvings, symbols I didn't recognize, jagged and erratic, like someone had scratched them in a frenzy. The air smelled damp, but beneath that, something else. Something rotten. There was a wooden chair in the center of the room, turned toward the doorway, as if someone had been sitting there, watching. We didn't stay long. Back outside, Eric pointed at something near the tree line. What is that? I followed his gaze. A figure, not moving, not approaching, just standing there between the trees. It was too far to make out clearly, but I knew someone was watching us. We need to go, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric hesitated, but when the figure shifted, just slightly, he nodded. We grabbed our packs and hiked back as fast as we could, barely speaking. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following us, but there was nothing. That night, back at camp, I barely slept. Every sound, every rustling leaf, every crack of a branch set my nerves on edge. I could feel something out there, just beyond the reach of our firelight. Then around 3 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling our tent. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept by my side. I wanted to wake Eric, but before I could, the footsteps stopped. Silence. And then, from just outside the thin fabric of the tent, a whisper. You shouldn't have come. I bolted upright, heart hammering. Eric stirred, groggy. What? Before he could finish, something slammed into the side of the tent. The entire structure shook. We scrambled for our gear, tore out of the tent and into the darkness. The fire had nearly burned out, casting only faint embers of light. Nothing was there. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been near us. We didn't waste time packing. We left everything behind and hiked through the night, barely stopping, barely breathing. By dawn, we reached the main trail, and by noon, we were back at our car. We never spoke about what happened. Not really. We told ourselves it was our imagination. That isolation plays tricks on the mind. But I know what I heard, and I know we weren't alone out there. I had always felt at home in the wilderness. There was something about the solitude, the untouched beauty, and the quiet hum of nature that made me feel alive. So when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the mountains, I wasn't afraid. I had done this before, many times, But something about this trip was different. I had hiked nearly 15 miles into the backcountry before setting up camp near a small, crystal-clear lake. The place was perfect. Far from any trails, surrounded by towering pines and completely isolated. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire listening to the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant rustling of animals in the underbrush. The air was crisp, and the stars stretched endlessly above me. But on the second night, things changed. I had been asleep for maybe an hour when I woke to a sound just outside my tent. It wasn't the usual rustling of small animals or the wind through the trees. It was deliberate, slow, careful footsteps circling my campsite. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I listened as the steps moved closer to my tent, stopping just outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever, or whoever, was out there. I reached for my knife and flashlight, but before I could unzip the tent, the footsteps retreated, fading into the forest. I waited, straining my ears for any sign of movement, but the only thing I could hear was the distant trickle of the lake's water. In the morning, I searched the perimeter of my campsite. There were footprints in the dirt, bare footprints, too large for an animal, too human to ignore. I should have packed up right then and there, but instead I convinced myself it was just some lost hiker, someone passing through. The wilderness was vast after all. That night I built up the fire higher than usual, its flickering glow casting long shadows across the trees. I sat up for hours, knife in hand, listening, waiting. Then sometime after midnight, I heard it again. This time it was breathing, deep, labored breathing, just outside my tent. My entire body froze. The fire had burned low, leaving only smoldering coals, and the darkness outside felt impenetrable. I gripped my knife tighter, ready to lash out at whatever was out there. Then slowly the breathing moved, circling the tent, pausing, then starting again. A sickening, dragging sound followed it, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight into the trees. Nothing. No footprints, no movement, just the silent, empty woods. But the air felt wrong, thick, suffocating. It was as if something was still there, just beyond the edges of the light. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At the first sign of dawn, I packed up and started hiking back the way I came. But as I made my way down the narrow trail, I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being followed. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, the forest fell silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. And once, just once, I thought I heard something mimicking my footsteps. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking. I tossed my gear in the back, slammed the door shut, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. I don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was something worse. But one thing is certain, I never went camping alone again. I had always loved the solitude of nature, the deep, endless forests where the world felt untouched by time. That's why I agreed when my friend Mark invited me on a week-long camping trip deep in the remote wilderness of Montana. No cell service, no roads, just miles of trees, rivers, and mountains. It sounded perfect. We hiked nearly 10 miles into the backcountry before setting up camp near an old dried-up riverbed. The place was eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of leaves in the wind, just silence. Mark joked that it was like nature was holding its breath. We both laughed, but I felt something strange settle in my chest, an uneasy weight I couldn't shake. That night, as we sat by the fire, we heard something distant, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I could recognize. It was a low, guttural wail, stretching unnaturally long, echoing through the trees. Mark turned to me. "That was weird," I nodded. "Probably just the wind," I lied. But deep down, I knew better. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it again. The sound. This time it was closer. I sat up, straining to listen. Mark was still asleep, snoring softly in his tent. The fire had died down, leaving only faint embers glowing in the dark. That's when I noticed the woods were completely silent again. No crickets, no wind, no life. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching the leaves just beyond my tent. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. The steps circled our campsite once, twice, then stopped. I forced myself to peek outside. The forest was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning I told Mark what I heard. He brushed it off, saying it was probably a deer or some other animal. But when we stepped out of our tents, we found something strange. There were markings on the trees surrounding our camp. Long, deep scratches, as if something had clawed through the bark in perfect, deliberate lines. Mark stared at them, his confidence wavering. That's not normal. We debated leaving, but we had hiked so far in. It seemed ridiculous to turn back because of a few weird noises. So we stayed. That night, the noises came again. But this time, they weren't far away. They were right outside our tents. By the third night, Mark and I were exhausted. Neither of us had slept. The wailing, the footsteps, it never stopped. Every time we thought it was gone, it would start again. Around 2 a.m., I heard something new. Breathing, deep, heavy breathing just outside my tent flap. I could feel the presence of something standing there, waiting. I held my knife so tightly my hand ached. Mark whispered from his tent, "Do you hear that?" Before I could answer, something dragged its fingers down the fabric of my tent. Long, slow, deliberate. I bolted upright, fumbling for my flashlight. I unzipped the tent in one swift motion and shone the beam outside. Nothing. But the trees just beyond the firelight, they were filled with figures, tall, thin, barely visible in the darkness, watching us. I turned to Mark, my breath frozen in my throat. "Run!" We grabbed what little we could and ran. We didn't stop running until we reached the car at the trailhead. We never spoke about what we saw. We never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that same wailing sound outside my window. And I know the woods never really let you go.